the investigation and impact of cattle mutilations in Crook County. Sergeant Mitch Madden of the Crook County Sheriff's Department guided his patrol car down a dusty access road leading to the Thompson Cattle Ranch in eastern Oregon. As the gravel crunched beneath his tires, he noticed 3 other police vehicles already stationed near a group of officers in the open field. Rancher Bill Thompson stood among them, his arm outstretched, pointing toward something in the distance. Madden parked and joined the group. Even though the morning air carried the crispness of early fall, sweat already trickled down the officers' faces. As he approached, he saw why. About 50 feet away lay a 1,200-pound black Angus cow, its lifeless body sprawled on its side. Even from this distance, Madden could sense something was wrong. This was no ordinary livestock death. Thompson explained he'd found the animal that morning during his routine check. At first, he thought it might have been a predator, a coyote or maybe a mountain lion, but one look told him this was different, much different. The cow's eyes, reproductive organs and part of its jaw were gone, removed with surgical precision. What chilled everyone most? There wasn't a single drop of blood around the scene, no signs of a struggle, no tracks leading to or from the body. The officers were as baffled as the rancher. One deputy pointed out how clean the cuts were, like they'd been made with a laser. Another noted the ground itself was undisturbed, no bent grass, no scuff marks. It was as if the animal had been dropped from the sky. This wasn't an isolated incident either. It marked the 6th cow mutilation in Crook County that year. Each case followed the same eerie pattern. Back at his patrol car, Sergeant Madden made a call to Keith Carson, a local veterinarian who'd examined 3 of the previous mutilations. Carson, a man with over 30 years of experience, had seen a lot in his career. But this defied explanation. Keith described the cuts as impossibly precise, far beyond what any predator could manage. It wasn't just the precision, it was the absence of blood. And then there was something even stranger. Carson had seen this before. In the 1970s, while working with the FBI, Keith investigated similar cases in Nebraska. Ranchers there reported mutilated cattle alongside accounts of strange lights in the sky the night their animals were taken. So, what's happening here? Coincidence or something much darker? The cuts on the mutilated cattle were identical to those Keith Carson had encountered decades ago, and he couldn't shake the feeling that these events were connected. A week after the latest discovery, Bill Thompson sat in Sergeant Madden's office, visibly troubled as he recounted how the incident had upended life on his ranch. The cattle avoided that section of the pasture entirely. Even Thompson's dogs, typically fearless, refused to approach the area. Over the past month, 3 more cows had vanished without a trace. Desperate, Thompson had started conducting armed patrols of his property at night, but it brought him little comfort. The unease had seeped into his home. His children were plagued by relentless nightmares, and his wife, emotionally drained, was urging him to sell the ranch and move to the city. Bill wasn't alone in his struggles. Other ranchers in the area were reporting similarly bizarre phenomena. Jim Baker, who owned the neighboring ranch, told officers that his cattle had been behaving erratically for weeks. The animals would cluster together at night, forming a defensive circle with their heads facing outward, as though warding off an unseen threat. Even the most docile cows had become aggressive and skittish. There was no apparent reason for their distress, but the behavior was unnervingly consistent. By this point, the Crook County Sheriff's Department was completely overwhelmed. They lacked the training, resources, and even a clear starting point to address the problem. Patrols in rural areas were increased, but with hundreds of square miles to cover and limited manpower, the task seemed impossible. Tensions were mounting and the questions loomed larger. What was happening to these cattle? And what, or who, was responsible? The Sheriff's Department, recognizing they couldn't protect every ranch, reached out to the FBI for assistance. However, the federal response was underwhelming, offering little beyond acknowledgement. This wasn't surprising, but it was frustrating, especially as similar cases were surfacing in other states, all equally baffling and unresolved. Local veterinarians and researchers from Oregon State University were brought in to examine tissue samples from 2 of the mutilated cattle. What they found was chilling. The cuts appeared to have been made with a tool that could simultaneously cut and cauterize the wounds, technology typically confined to advanced medical facilities. Stranger still, unusual chemical compounds were detected in the tissue, compounds that defied easy explanation. A disturbing pattern began to emerge. Every mutilation occurred during the new moon, when the nights were at their darkest. In response, ranchers started taking drastic measures. Infrared cameras and motion sensors were installed across properties, while some hired private security to patrol their land. Others, overwhelmed and terrified, sold their herds and abandoned the business altogether. Despite these precautions, no concrete answers were ever found. Worse yet, the phenomenon wasn't isolated to Oregon. Similar cattle mutilations were being reported in places as far-flung as Argentina, England, and Australia. The events in Crook County that year were part of a global and decades-long pattern. Even after years of investigation, the question remains, who or what is responsible for these mutilations? If you find yourself hiking in the Pacific Northwest, it might be wise to stay prepared. After all, the unknown still lurks in the shadows, and sometimes it's better to be safe than sorry. Marcus pulled his converted Sprinter van into a dispersed camping spot near Mount Rainier National Park on the evening of July 15, 2023. Fresh from a van life meetup in Washington, where about 30 enthusiasts had gathered to swap stories and compare rigs, Marcus decided to make the most of his proximity to the park by finding a secluded spot in the forest for the night. He drove 4 miles down a fire road from the park entrance, parking in a small clearing marked on apps and shared in van lifer Facebook groups. The spot was quiet, surrounded by towering trees with a faint trail leading toward a riverbank. After parking, Marcus settled into his usual evening routine. He had all the ingredients ready to make carne asada tacos, and had downloaded a few movies to watch later. His van was well equipped, a propane stove, running water, and solar panels to power his appliances. Before dinner, he decided to explore the area. The forest seemed peaceful but not entirely untouched. Scattered beer cans and food wrappers hinted at previous visitors. He followed the winding path down to the riverbank but found nothing noteworthy. Cars occasionally passed by on the nearby fire road, their drivers searching for their own campsites, a common sight on summer evenings as darkness crept in. Returning to his van as the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus began cooking his dinner. He'd already contacted his family to let them know his location, a safety measure he never skipped. The tranquility of the evening, however, didn't last. A low, distant, booming sound shattered the quiet. It was rhythmic, like cannon fire, the echoes rolling through the valley every few seconds. The noise was unsettling but not immediately alarming. Then, over the booms, he heard another sound, a chainsaw, closer but still distant enough that he couldn't pinpoint its location. The combination of sounds was bizarre, and while it didn't yet make Marcus feel threatened, it was enough to set him on edge. Marcus initially brushed off the strange noises as common occurrences in the area. Gunshots from target practice and chainsaws for cutting firewood weren't unusual in the remote Pacific Northwest. What did unsettle him, however, was remembering an RV he'd seen earlier that evening. It had pulled out suddenly, along with several other campers who had just settled in. They seemed unusually concerned as they left, making Marcus wonder why they had abandoned such a prime camping spot. Feeling a twinge of paranoia, Marcus double-checked that all his van's windows and doors were locked. He tried to relax for the night, but what followed was beyond anything he could have prepared for. The experience was hazy, disorienting. A fragmented series of memories, like trying to piece together a fading nightmare. The first thing he recalled was being awake in utter darkness, struggling to breathe. It wasn't choking, but a horrifying sensation as though he was drowning, even as his lungs filled with air. Panic overtook him. He vaguely remembered punching one of his van windows in desperation, then stumbling toward the side doors, clawing to open them. The terror was overwhelming, but then, nothing. Darkness swallowed him whole. The next thing Marcus knew, sunlight was streaming through the windows of his van. At first, he thought it had all been a vivid nightmare. But as he looked around, the damage inside his van told a different story. Several of his window blinds were shredded, and one of the windows bore deep scratch marks on the inside. The ceiling air vent was destroyed, as though something had burst through it. His knuckles were bruised and swollen, his feet sore, likely from kicking the cabinets in his panic. A metal pole he used for his awning lay broken in the middle of the floor. What disturbed him most was that all the destruction seemed to have happened inside the van, yet there were no signs of forced entry, and the van had been well ventilated. His carbon monoxide detector hadn't gone off, ruling out gas poisoning. Nothing about the night made sense. What had caused his panic? And what, or who, had left such destruction in its wake? A few months before Marcus's unsettling solo camping trip in March, he had camped near the same area with his friends Kurt and Melissa. They had gotten a tip at a local gas station about some excellent dispersed camping spots on the mountain. By the time they arrived, it was already dark. Not ideal, but they were too tired to keep searching, and settled for what seemed like the best option after passing several muddy and uneven areas. Marcus helped Kurt and Melissa set up their tent, enthusiastically telling them about his newly converted van. He had only been using it for a few weeks and was excited to put it to the test. The campsite had an odd vibe, and Kurt and Melissa jokingly dubbed it the ominous slant. That night, however, strange things began to happen. Melissa told Marcus the next morning that she had heard someone, or something, walking around their tent, producing a peculiar squeaking sound like latex rubbing against itself. She jokingly referred to it as the happy gimper. Kurt, on the other hand, was convinced he had heard a bear nearby. But the most unnerving incident came from Marcus's van. At some point in the night, both Kurt and Melissa were startled awake by Marcus's blood-curdling screams. The screams were so intense that they feared Marcus was being attacked, or worse. Kurt scrambled out of his tent, rushed to the van, and flung open the doors. But to his shock, Marcus was lying there, peacefully asleep. Confused, Kurt woke him up and asked what had happened. Marcus had no memory of screaming, nightmares, or anything unusual. He was just as bewildered as Kurt and Melissa. Reflecting on the two episodes, this one and the recent terror in the van, both had occurred near Mount Rainier. The strange events seemed straight out of a Twilight Zone episode, yet they were eerily real. Interestingly, park rangers around Mount Rainier often refer to it simply as the mountain, as if it is singular and unique. Legends and lore surrounding the area abound, from UFO sightings to other bizarre phenomena. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong from the moment he arrived at the campsite during his solo trip. Whatever happened that night may forever remain a mystery. Marcus has vowed never to camp near Mount Rainier again. Was it just his imagination, or is there something truly unexplainable lurking in the shadow of the mountain? James Wilson, a construction foreman, was overseeing the exhumation of graves at Seattle's oldest cemetery on October 12, 1886. The city planned to repurpose the burial ground into what would later become Denny Park, and Wilson's team was tasked with carefully relocating the remains to a new cemetery. Having done this kind of work many times before, Wilson knew what to expect: wooden coffins, often rotted, with mostly decomposed remains inside. The process was routine: transfer the remains into new caskets and re-enter them elsewhere. Things had gone smoothly until the team reached a grave marked for Mary Ann Conlon, who had passed away in 1873. Wilson recognized the name. She had been featured in the newspapers for running Seattle's first hotel in the 1850s and was known for her fiery reputation. When the workers started digging, they immediately noticed something strange. At the coffin level, their shovels, which typically sliced easily through decayed wood, began striking something solid. It took considerable effort to expose the coffin fully. Once unearthed, Wilson crouched to inspect it and realized that despite being buried for 13 years, the wood was remarkably well preserved, showing almost no signs of decay. It took all 6 men to lift the coffin due to its unexpected weight, and when they pried it open, what they found inside made them recoil in shock. Instead of decomposed remains, they uncovered what appeared to be a perfectly preserved statue of a woman. Mary Ann Conlon's body had turned completely white and solid as marble. Her features, frozen in time, were so pristine that she looked like a masterful sculpture rather than a long-buried corpse. Wilson tapped her arm and it emitted a sound akin to striking granite. The discovery quickly drew a crowd. Wilson sent one of his workers to fetch a doctor or scientist, someone who might explain how a human body could petrify into stone. By the afternoon, dozens of people, including reporters and medical professionals, had gathered at the cemetery, eager to see the marble woman. A journalist from the local paper repeatedly touched her calcified form, utterly bewildered. Every inch of her body was stone, yet her facial features remained eerily lifelike. Doctors arrived to examine the remains, but none could provide an explanation. Theories ranged from mineral-rich soil causing petrification to supernatural phenomena, yet none held up under scrutiny. Despite the mystery, the crew eventually moved Marianne Conlon to her new resting place on Capitol Hill. The petrified woman was reburied, but the story spread quickly, capturing the imagination of locals and beyond. To this day, no one has been able to explain how Marianne Conlon's body transformed into what looked like a marble statue. A chilling reminder that some mysteries may never be solved. In 1851, Marianne Conlon arrived in Seattle under circumstances that immediately set tongues wagging. She had been married to a sea captain who, for reasons unknown, abruptly abandoned her at the port in Port Townsend. Instead of returning east or wallowing in her misfortune, Marianne made her way to the fledgling settlement of Seattle, a place that was little more than a scattering of wooden structures surrounded by dense forest. From the moment she arrived, she took charge of her life in the town. She secured ownership of the Filker House, the town's only hotel, a two-story structure that had been shipped piece by piece around South America from the East Coast. The building stood out in the rough settlement, boasting real glass windows, proper furniture, and even curtains, a sign of luxury in an otherwise rugged environment. By day, the Filker House operated like any other hotel. Marianne rented out rooms to travelers and even allowed the townsfolk to use some of the space as makeshift courtrooms. However, as night fell, the hotel transformed into something much more unusual. Locals noticed men coming and going at odd hours, and Marianne seemed to be earning far more money than a regular hotel could. The whispers began. Was it a front for something more scandalous? Adding to her reputation was Marianne's fiery temper, which earned her the nickname Madame Damnable. Her sharp tongue was infamous, and she was known to tear into anyone who dared cross her. She ruled her domain with an iron will, and her presence was as intimidating as it was commanding. In 1856, tensions between settlers and the local indigenous tribes were escalating, prompting the U.S. Navy to dispatch the Decatur to help defend Seattle. As part of their efforts, the Navy decided to improve a dirt road that passed by Marianne's hotel. But when their men arrived with tools and supplies, Marianne emerged like a whirlwind of fury. Clad in her work apron, she stormed out of the Filker House with 3 massive dogs at her side, barking ferociously. Her apron was loaded with stones, and she began hurling them at the Navy workers with incredible force, all while unleashing a torrent of curses that even the most hardened sailors had never heard. The dogs snarled and lunged, making the soldiers scatter in fear. It was said that not even the officers could stand their ground against her wrath, retreating as though they were being pursued by the devil himself. Her fearsome reputation extended beyond such encounters. There was the story of a drunken customer who tried to skip out on his bill, only to be chased down 3 muddy blocks by Marianne herself. She reportedly dragged him back to the hotel, berating him every step of the way. Marianne Conlon's larger-than-life personality ensured her place in local lore. Her transformation into a marble-like statue decades later in her grave only cemented her legacy as one of Seattle's most mysterious and formidable figures. Even in death, Madame Damnable's story remains as unforgettable as her life. Described vividly, she detailed exactly what she would do to him if he tried that again. Her reputation grew so notorious that when Seattle's first official map was drawn, they didn't even bother marking Filker House. Instead, they labeled it as Madame Damble. She had an uncanny ability to switch seamlessly between multiple languages: English, French, Spanish, German, and various Chinese dialects, a remarkable skill in the 1850s. This made her establishment an unusual blend of high society and chaos. Her hotel thrived, especially at night, with music playing, elegant women arriving, and wealthy men gathering, ostensibly for lodging. Unsurprisingly, she amassed a fortune. Other struggling local businesses often borrowed money from her, but she somehow always knew who would repay her and who wouldn't. Those who didn't repay seemed to leave town mysteriously quickly. By 1873, she passed away, yet no one knew her age. She had always kept it a secret. The strangest part of her death was how her body turned to stone, leaving people baffled. The only explanation anyone could muster was that even in death, she remained as stubborn as ever. On a warm August morning in 1980, a 32-year-old man named Larry Kelm parked his pickup truck in a small dirt lot near Eugene, Oregon. Adjusting his backpack, he set off toward the trailhead of the old Molalla Indian Trail. This trail, connecting Mount Saddle Blanket to Oak Ridge, had been used for centuries by local tribes before settlers arrived. By then, it had become a popular hiking destination, especially in summer when the weather was perfect. The trail wound through dense forests of Douglas fir and western red cedar, characteristic of Oregon's wilderness. Larry had hiked parts of this trail before and knew that on clear days, you could see the Cascade Mountains from certain ridges. The morning air was crisp and refreshing, the kind you'd expect in August in the Pacific Northwest. One of Larry's favorite aspects of the hike was the overwhelming scent of pine needles, immersing him completely in nature for hours. At one point during his hike, Larry began to feel an inexplicable unease. The forest around him started to blur, as though he were viewing it through someone else's glasses. The vibrant greens of the trees and foliage faded into dull grays. Even though the sun was still visible above, it was as if a massive shadow had engulfed the trail, though there was nothing overhead to cause it. Larry halted, blinking rapidly, convinced something was wrong with his vision. Yet the haze remained. Looking down at his hands, he saw that even they seemed slightly out of focus, reinforcing the surreal sensation. The world around him resembled an improperly developed photograph, muted, unclear, and unnervingly unnatural. Then, as abruptly as it began, he stepped through what felt like an invisible barrier, and everything shifted. His vision cleared, but the scene before him was unrecognizable. It was no longer mid-morning in the familiar Oregon forest. Instead, he appeared to be standing in the middle of the night. The gentle breeze rustling through the trees had vanished. Turning in a slow circle, Larry realized the familiar Douglas firs and cedars were gone. In their place stood dense alien vegetation, more like a tropical jungle than the Pacific Northwest. The air was thick and oppressive, humid in a way that Oregon forests never were. Strangely, despite the absence of a moon or stars, the surroundings were bathed in an eerie light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. Then, piercing the silence, a high-pitched sound rang out. It was unlike anything Larry had ever heard. Not a bird's call, not an animal's cry, nor any mechanical noise. The sound seemed to bypass his ears entirely, drilling straight into his mind. Panic surged through him as an overwhelming sense of dread took hold. Suddenly a voice whispered, "Gotcha!" close to his right ear. The word sent icy terror coursing through Larry's body. He froze, his heart seemingly stopping for a brief moment before he forced himself to take a shaky breath of the dense, suffocating air. Instinctively, he began backing away, retracing his steps. As he moved, something brushed against him from behind. Larry whirled around, adrenaline surging, his senses heightened to every movement in the oppressive, otherworldly jungle. Out of the corner of his eye, over his right shoulder, Larry caught sight of a massive, dark, hairy arm reaching toward him. The arm ended in a hand with pale, almost human-like fingernails that appeared unnervingly clean and well-maintained. However, the hand's structure was odd. The thumb was positioned lower than it would be on a human. The arm was muscular, covered in coarse black hair, and radiated a predatory strength. As Larry recoiled in terror, the creature's thumb grazed his neck. Though the touch didn't break the skin, it sent a cold shiver down his spine. He watched in horror as the hand closed around empty air, exactly where his throat had been just a moment earlier. Instinctively, he stumbled backward, desperate to put distance between himself and the thing that had nearly caught him. In an instant, everything shifted again. The surreal jungle disappeared, and Larry found himself back in the familiar forest. The air was crisp, the trees around him unmistakable. He could breathe again, but his chest heaved with panic. Something deep within him, however, urged him to look ahead. Directly in front of him, Larry saw a strange, oval-shaped distortion in the air. It shimmered and warped, like the mirage of heat rising from hot pavement. He stood frozen, watching as the bizarre shape gradually shrank, growing smaller and smaller until it vanished entirely, leaving no trace of its existence. Larry's encounter on the Molalla Trail was nothing short of eerie. The dense forest seemed to close in around him, and an unsettling silence filled the air. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent chills down his spine. It was as if the forest itself was alive, holding its breath, waiting. Overwhelmed by terror, Larry turned and ran. Sprinting as fast as his legs could carry him, he bolted back to his truck, his mind racing, every nerve screaming with the urge to escape whatever had nearly taken him. The fear was palpable, almost suffocating, as he pushed himself harder, desperate to put as much distance as possible between him and the unknown. Larry had no idea how he would explain what had happened, or to whom he could possibly tell such a bizarre story. For a long time he chose to stay silent, keeping the experience to himself. However, the encounter left him deeply shaken, and he suffered from recurring horrific nightmares. The images were vivid, haunting his sleep and leaving him restless, always on edge. Interestingly, the trail where this occurred, the old Malala Indian Trail, is still frequented by hikers today. While no one has reported experiences identical to Larry's, there have been other strange incidents. During the summer of 1980, the same year as Larry's encounter, several hikers in the Mount Saddle Blanket area reported odd magnetic anomalies. These anomalies disrupted compasses and other navigation equipment, a phenomenon often attributed to underground mineral deposits. 3 days before Larry's experience, a seasoned trail maintenance worker named Jim Wills had documented something equally strange. While marking trees for removal along the same section of the trail, Wills noticed that his radio completely stopped working in a specific area. When he stepped back about 20 feet, the radio resumed functioning as normal. Wills made a note of the location in his logbook, planning to have the utility lines checked for interference. However, utility workers who later investigated the area found no apparent issues. These unexplained occurrences add an eerie layer of intrigue to Larry's already chilling experience, leaving the true nature of what he encountered that day a mystery. The utility workers who investigated the site reported no electrical anomalies in the area. Despite this, the Malala Trail was rerouted slightly in 1983, with official records citing terrain stability concerns as the reason. However, some historians noted that this specific section of the trail had been avoided by the Malala tribe for centuries. Tribal maps reportedly mark the area as a place where the air becomes strange, adding another layer of mystery to the already eerie stories surrounding it. As the story ends, I encourage viewers who made it this far to comment "strange air" below, signaling they stayed through the entire tale. If you enjoyed deep dives into mysterious and supernatural cases, please like and subscribe for more similar content in future episodes. With a heartfelt sign-off, I remind everyone to keep an open mind and look forward to the next episode.